Thank you very much, Jessica, and thanks to you and Division II and others for inviting me to give this talk. G. Stanley Hall was obviously a great figure in psychology and someone who I've had a historical interest in, so it's really nice to be giving a G. Stanley Hall lecture. And the general topic of the talk today, as indicated by the title, is going to involve a focus on something that, for those of us who study memory, make it really interesting to study, namely the fact that memory is not perfect. It's subject to various kinds of errors and illusions that can have great significance in the real world, but are extremely interesting theoretically and keep memory researchers like myself and many others engaged with our topic. And I wanted to start off just with a few kind of everyday examples of different kinds of memory errors. The first relates to what might be the most important case in the modern era of psychology and cognitive neuroscience of how a kind of memory error informed our understanding of the way that memory works. And that relates to the story of the person depicted here, Henry Molaison, better known in the literature as the amnesic patient H.M., who died a few years ago. And as many of you know, back in the 1950s, Henry H.M. Had an operation for relief of intractable epilepsy that left him normal in many respects, or most respects, but left him with a devastating impairment in the ability to create new memories that could last over time. He could converse normally. His IQ really didn't change very much as a function of the operation, but he couldn't create new lasting memories. They disappeared just about as quickly as an experience happened. And because the operation that he had was focused on one particular part of the brain, namely the inner or medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, shown in the two circles, that really hammered home for the first time in human cognitive neuroscience the importance of the hippocampus and related structures in allowing us to create new memories that last over time. But you don't have to have hippocampal damage in order to forget, and even forget in a dramatic way. This next example, I have to thank Dr. Gil Einstein, a memory researcher here in the audience, for alerting me to this very interesting case study. This is an individual who had planned a bank robbery in New Zealand, attempted to rob a bank, but unfortunately forgot his mask. You can't quite see that in the somewhat dark slide, and forgot his gun. So as a function of forgetting both his mask and gun, he and his partner were apprehended, written up in the New Zealand Herald the next day. Two men have had a night in the cells to reflect on the importance of planning after one of them forgot his mask and gun while allegedly attempting an armed holdup. Thank you, Gil, for that nice example. Well, these kinds of things happen in places other than New Zealand as well. We're all probably familiar with that example from the presidential debates when poor old Rick Perry couldn't recall the third federal agency that he wanted to eliminate in addition to commerce and education. Eventually came to the realization that it was the Energy Department, but it was a riveting moment for memory researchers who are forever thankful to Governor Perry for giving us this nice example to use in lectures and classes. The final example that I want to begin with is a little more serious one. This would be familiar to some of the memory folks in the crowd or people who have read Seven Sins of Memory or Searching for Memory, an earlier book, where I talked about this example. Donald Thompson is himself a memory researcher. He got his PhD at the University of Toronto working with Endel Tulving, who was my mentor there. And went back to his native Australia, where he carried on memory research for a number of years and also was involved in testifying on eyewitness cases involving memory. Well, you can imagine how shocked Thompson was then when one day the police accused him of raping a woman who had in fact been brutally raped. There was no question about that. What was troubling was that she remembered that rape in enough detail to send the police to Donald Thompson's door. She remembered him that well. Well, thankfully for Thompson, he had an airtight alibi. He could not possibly have committed this rape because at the moment the rape was occurred, he was giving a live television interview about, of all things, memory and memory distortion. So it couldn't have been him. What happened then? Well, the woman who was raped was watching that interview when an intruder broke into her house and raped her. And in the stress of that moment, she confused where her memory of Thompson came from. It really came from the TV screen, but she thought it was the face of the rapist. Things might have turned out differently had that been a taped interview that she was watching. He wouldn't have had the alibi. Thankfully for Thompson, it was live. Well, this gives you a feel for some of the kind of dramatic memory errors that can occur, and they're certainly well known to psychologists who've been studying memory for a long time. But it occurred to me a little over a decade ago that even though we know a lot about different kinds of memory errors, no one had really sat down and tried to provide kind of a classificatory or organizational scheme for thinking about the different kinds of memory errors that occur. So by analogy with the 7 ancient deadly sins, in an article initially published in American Psychologist in '99, and then a book titled The 7 Sins of Memory, I argued for the idea that we could organize memory errors into 7 basic categories, or quote-unquote sins. The first 3 all involve different kinds of forgetting. I called them the sins of omission. The first, transience, refers to the fact that all other things being equal, memories tend to become decreasingly accessible over time. HM would be an extreme example of how a certain kind of brain damage to the hippocampus accelerates this normal process of transience. Absent-mindedness refers to lapses of attention that result in forgetting to do things. The kind of example that we saw in the bank robber. These would be errors of prospective memory, as studied by Einstein and McDaniel, who I'm glad are both here at the talk. But those absent-minded memory errors are really different from transience. So HM will never be able to remember the events that fade away from in his mind. Whereas, had you reminded that thief that, hey, is there a gun or a mask that's supposed to be involved in this robbery, he immediately would have known, yes, I should have them. They haven't dropped out of his mind. He's just not attending to cues that would get him to remember that information. And then finally, a third kind of forgetting-related sin in this scheme is I call blocking, and that refers to a temporary inaccessibility of stored information, even under conditions in which cues are present and you're trying to remember the information. There's no question of a lapse of attention here. That would be in the Rick Perry example. He later came up with the fact that it was the energy department that was the third one that he wanted to eliminate, and so we'll give him credit that he had the information stored somewhere in his brain, most likely, but he blocked on it at the moment in that debate when he needed that information. The next 3 of the memory sins are all what I call sins of commission. These are cases in which memory is present, but it's wrong. Misattribution refers to situations in which we attribute a memory to an incorrect source, resulting in a phenomenon called false recognition that we're going to talk a lot about in this lecture. And obviously the Donald Thompson example would be a clear example of misattribution. The woman who was raped had a clear memory of Thompson, but she attributed it to the wrong source. And misattribution errors can be quite damaging because of the high confidence associated with the fact that you retrieve some aspect of an event correctly. That can imbue you with a very strong but false sense of confidence if you misattribute the memory to the wrong source. A related kind of memory distortion I call suggestibility. That refers to implanted memories, the kind of thing that people like Elizabeth Loftus have studied in the literature on misinformation and suggestion leading to implanted memories. By Bias refers to retrospective distortions that are produced by our current knowledge and beliefs. That is, when what we currently know, believe, and feel skews our memory for past experience. There are many examples of that in the cognitive and social psychology literature. And the final of the 7 sins, another sin of commission, albeit a bit different from the preceding ones, I refer to as persistence, and that involves unwanted recollections of information that we can't forget. So this would occur, for example, after traumatic experiences where there are intrusive and sometimes disabling memories that occur as a result of these highly arousing and disturbing experiences can result in memory persistence. So those are the 7 sins as of 1999 and 2001, and now over a decade has passed. And we've learned a lot about each of these memory sins, both at the cognitive level and at the level of brain function, and I would love to be able to go through each of the 7 and update everything we know, but that would make for a very, very rushed talk. So instead, what I'm going to do is focus in on just one of the sins, and that's the sin of misattribution that we've already talked a little bit about, because I think it's one of the most theoretically interesting. It's also very practically important, and it's something we've studied in my lab, so I can tell you a little bit about what's gone on in my lab over the past decade that's relevant to understanding misattribution. On the practical side, again, even though the work that we do in my lab is primarily oriented toward elucidating the cognitive and neural underpinnings of misattribution from kind of a basic science perspective, it is very important. So I think one of the phenomena that make that point very nicely is shown here in this graph from the Innocence Project on factors leading to wrongful conviction of the first 130 individuals who were exonerated of crimes based on DNA evidence. And there are a variety of sources, but you can see that by far the dominant one is mistaken identification, often involving misattribution errors of the kind that we saw in the Donald Thompson case. So understanding misattribution clearly has important implications for the real world. There'll be 4 main parts to the talk. First, we're going to talk a little bit about misattribution in the brain, focusing in on the hippocampus, which we talked about briefly with respect to HM. Second, we'll talk about storage versus retrieval factors in misattribution and some, to my mind, somewhat surprising new data coming from our lab recently that bear on this issue. Then we'll talk about misattribution in relation to the interesting phenomenon of memory reactivation. And finally, talk briefly about misattribution in the context of adaptive memory processes. So let's start then by talking a little bit about misattribution in the brain, focusing in on the role of the hippocampus, because it's been so important in memory research, really from the work with HM on as one of the key players in our ability to create and retrieve memories about what's happened to us. And to get to that topic, I just first want to say a couple of words very briefly about one of the paradigms developed over the last 15 or 20 years that has been useful in studying misattribution. This will be well known to many of you. The Diess-Roediger-McDermott, or DRM paradigm, involving false recognition of semantic associates, something that Diess first discovered back in 1959 as it applied to recall. Roediger and McDermott revived and extended to recognition, an important paper published in 1995. And again, as many of you probably know, what's involved here is people are exposed to a list of semantic associates that all converge on a non-presented theme word or critical lure. So candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, et cetera, would be one such list of highly related associated words that could be presented to the subject. There'd be many other such lists. Later on, you're given some words from the study list, such as taste, unrelated words that weren't presented and that have nothing to do with the items on the study list, like point, and then an associatively related theme word or critical lure like sweet. And that's where the interesting phenomenon happens, because what Roediger and McDermott showed in their 95 paper with recognition is that people exhibit extremely high levels of false alarms to this theme word, accompanied by very high confidence. Anybody who's ever tried this as a class demonstration, it never fails, at least with naive subjects. Here are some representative data from an old study that was done by Ken Norman when he was a graduate student in my lab, comparing young adults, college students with older adults in their 70s. And what we're looking at is the proportion of old responses to the words that really were on the list, like taste. The true targets, young and old, are pretty good at identifying those items, close to 80% correct, but the striking phenomenon is false alarms to the word sweet, the related false target that wasn't on the list. They're false alarming about as often as they're making a correct response, and the older adults, in fact, are showing an increased susceptibility to this kind of misattribution error. False alarms to totally unrelated words that had nothing to do with what was in the study list are down around 15–20%. So this is a massive effect. Well, we got interested early on in this work when we're trying to kind of develop a cognitive neuroscience approach to memory distortion and misattribution in the question of what the neural underpinnings of this phenomenon are. And one of the findings from an early paper was a PET imaging study done with Eric Ryman, a number of others, Roediger and McDermott collaborated on this paper, is that when you scan people, when they're making old new recognition decisions, and you look at brain activity when they're making a hit, saying yes to an item that really was there, and compare it to brain activity when they're making a related false alarm, they're claiming incorrectly that sweet was on the list, what you see is for true recognition on the top and false on the bottom, that there was comparable levels of activity in the hippocampal region, as well as a bunch of other regions that I'm not showing you. That was very interesting to us, and in a follow-up study where our lab collaborated with Roberto Cabez's lab, a study published in 2001, we replicated this result and extended it in various ways. More recently, we've found that this phenomenon of hippocampal activation during false recognition of a related lure item is not restricted to the DRM paradigm or to words. So in a study led by Scott Slotnick, when Scott was a postdoc in the lab that we published a number of years ago, we used kind of a nonverbal version, if you will, of a DRM paradigm. Based on earlier work showing that people tend to false alarm to visual prototypes of items that are highly similar to exemplars that they've seen in a study list. They'll false alarm to a non-studied prototype that was the basis for creating those exemplars. Classic work by Posner and Keel in the late 60s showed this. So in the Slotnick paradigm, there are exemplars of abstract shapes, as you see in the top example. Those abstract shapes are generated by the non-studied prototype. There are a bunch of these. The subject studies 16 sets of 9 exemplars, highly similar looking to the non-studied prototype, though people have no problem distinguishing them visually. And then after they're given a bunch of sets of these abstract shapes, they're given an old new recognition test that includes old items, related new items, the non-studied prototype that they didn't see, and unrelated items. And of course, the behavioral data, not surprisingly, show a robust false recognition effect to the non-studied prototype. What was most interesting to us is that this is an fMRI study, and when you do an analysis of fMRI activations where you ask the questions, what brain regions activate similarly for true recognition to a shape that you really saw, and false recognition to the prototype that you think you saw but you didn't, what we found is that a variety of regions, including prefrontal and parietal cortex that have been previously implicated in accurate memory, turn on for false alarms to the prototype as well. And most interesting, for the present purposes, we found evidence for hippocampal activity also for both true and false recognition. So that result turns up again and again in these paradigms where you've got a very robust false recognition effect occurring. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that there are no differences between true and false recognition. Each of these papers actually showed some, and just as an aside, in the Slotnick paper, it was found that some early visual regions, early in the visual processing stream, show greater activity when you recognize a shape you really saw as compared to one that you that only looks like what you saw. So there is an ability of the brain to distinguish true versus false recognition, but a lot of memory-related regions come on board, including the hippocampus, when you falsely recognize an item such as in the DRM paradigm or in the abstract shape paradigm. Well, this created a bit of a paradox for us. Because on the one hand, I've just showed you evidence, and other labs have found it as well, that the hippocampus shows this false recognition-related response in experimental paradigms that produce high levels of what I'm going to call today gist-based false recognition, where your recognition seems to be based on the gist of what you've seen, the general features or similarities, as opposed to the exact item. That's why you false alarm. So it's showing these false recognition-related responses in those paradigms, but hippocampal activity is related to accurate responding in many other paradigms I don't have the time to go into. Just ordinary memory paradigms, you see hippocampal activity activating during accurate recognition and its activity at encoding predicting later accurate recognition. So how do we reconcile these two things? The hippocampus is often related to accurate responding in many memory paradigms, but in these gist-based paradigms it seems to show up in false memory as well, inaccurate memory. Well, one possibility that we explored in a recent study led by my former postdoc, Angela Gutches, has to do with the degree of gist or strength of the gist representation that may be involved in these different cases. So consider the following example. So the question we ask is whether the hippocampal false memory response modulates with what I'm going to put in quotes, the strength of your memory for the gist of what you've been exposed to, where the idea is that it doesn't do much perhaps when gist is weak and really cranks up when gist is strong. What do I mean by that? So let's look at this example. Suppose I do an experiment and one of the items in the study list is this chair and another item is this chair, and then I wait a period of time and I give you a recognition test and I could test you for the items that were really there, and I can throw in a similar item, a related item. Well, you're probably going to have a pretty low false recognition response to this item, even if I delay the testing later, because I haven't built up much of a gist, if you will, of chairs to drive your false recognition response. You remember the individual items pretty well, and you say, no, that's not exactly what I saw. But we know from behavioral studies that, for example, if we can make a change in the paradigm, simple change, that will produce a different result. So suppose I show you this chair as before and that chair, but then I throw in that chair, and I throw in another chair, and I throw in another chair, and I throw in another chair. Then I give you a memory test later on. I say, did you see that? We know that you're going to be much more likely to false alarm when the gist now is stronger, to use the terms that I'm using, when you have a lot more information about chairs to drive that false recognition response. So that led Angela to do a very interesting study that was published in Neuroimage just a couple of months ago. And in this study, the issue of hippocampal false memory response being modulated by strength of gist representation was addressed using a simple paradigm involving materials just like the ones that we saw. Chairs were in fact one of the categories that were used, in which during encoding there's a manipulation of category size. So you study some small categories comprised, for example, of 4 chairs in a list. Medium would be 8 different chairs intermixed in the list, and large would be 14 different chairs intermixed in the list. And there are a bunch of different categories involved, and it's unblocked presentation, meaning they're all mixed up. And we expect that behaviorally we're going to find increasing false recognition with increasing set size here, stronger gist memory, if you will. And the question is, does hippocampal activity track that increase in gist produced by this category exemplar manipulation? fMRI data were collected during recognition, a recognition test for old exemplars, new related exemplars, the chairs that you haven't seen but look like what you saw, and new totally unrelated exemplars. Okay, there are a lot of data from this study. The behavioral data show As expected, that false alarms to the related items are lowest with the small set size, 19% false alarm rate, goes up to 24% in the medium, goes up to 30% in the large. So indeed, we get the expected behavioral effect. You're false alarming more when you've seen more chairs than fewer. Hit rate is up around 60%. I just want you to focus on the left panel here showing what's called a parametric modulation analysis of the fMRI data, showing those brain regions whose activity modulates with the increase in set size, large greater than small. There are 3 regions that show this effect, and critically for our purposes, one of them is the hippocampus. So as you can see, it doesn't look like it's doing much for the small and the medium, and then it really only cranks up with the large. So there are other interesting effects here that I don't have time to go into. We discuss in the paper, and I put a brief summary up on the slide. There are different visual regions that seem to modulate with gist strength, as it were, showing that same pattern as the hippocampus, more activity as for false alarms as the category size gets larger. Other visual regions show the exact opposite effect, where it looks as though they're distinguishing, they're responding on the basis of distinctive visual information. But the critical point is this may help to resolve this apparent discrepancy regarding the hippocampus and misattribution, that you're going to see it get involved when you build up a very strong gist representation, as in the kinds of paradigms that we've discussed so far. It will be related to false memory, whereas when you don't have that strong gist representation, it's not going to be involved in false memory. Okay, second point has to do with the distinction between storage and retrieval factors as they relate to misattribution. Now, what I'm going to call the standard account of gist-based false recognition that we've been talking about, this is kind of generally accepted. Certainly, me and others in my lab have talked about it this way in the past, is that what's going on here is that details concerning specific items fade quickly from memory, and we rely on more abstract information and attempt to reconstruct these details, sometimes resulting in false recognition. So when you false alarm to that chair, the thought is, maybe all you've got is the gist. You don't really have the details. They've faded away, and you're left with the gist information. So it's kind of an encoding or storage view of false recognition. I think at least implicitly and perhaps explicitly, that's generally what most people have thought is going on. But there's recent evidence that could cause us to question that view, and it comes from some very interesting work from Tim Brady, working out of Aude Oliva's lab at MIT, published initially a few years ago with George Alvarez and Talia Konkel. And they asked the question of how much detail can we store in memory about individual visual objects. Now, we already know from classic work published by Standing and others back in the 70s that the answer to that question at some level is a lot, because Standing showed that if I show you thousands of pictures, you can distinguish new from old pictures at a pretty good rate, even when I show you like up to 10,000 pictures, or at least he estimated that. So Brady and colleagues were following up on that kind of work, and what they did was they showed their subjects, who were very patient, willing subjects, 2,896 images for 3 seconds each of just everyday objects of the kind that we just looked at. And then they did a 2 alternative forced choice recognition test, in which one of the choices was in this case, the loaf of bread they saw. Let's say it's the one on the left. For some people, it'd be the one on the left. For others, the one on the right. And then in this particular condition, they just introduced a small state change, where it's the same object, but it's moved a little bit. Now, if you've just seen 3,000 objects, you've got to retain a lot of detail to remember correctly that it's the one on the left, not the one on the right, and vice versa. So you might think, based on what I've been telling you about gist-based false recognition, people would be terrible at doing this when you have to make such a fine discrimination. Standing never looked at that. But lo and behold, what they found is that in this condition, people were 87% correct in making that distinction about 10 minutes after they had studied the items. And that state change was one of several test conditions that they used. And when the subjects simply had to distinguish old from entirely new items, they were up at 93%. So The 87% is really pretty impressive when there's such a subtle change involved between the studied item and the distractor. Well, this got Scott Guerin and I thinking. Scott, a postdoc in my lab who just moved on to a faculty position in the University of Melbourne, about whether providing the target might reduce GIST-based false recognition of the kind that we and others have been studying. So Scott came up with a very interesting experimental paradigm, kind of a novel paradigm to test this, and the paper was published a few months back in the Journal of Memory Language. Cliff Robbins and Adrian Gilmore are also involved in this work. So you study a bunch of visual objects, just like we've been talking about, and then there are 4 different conditions. And it's a little bit of a different kind of recognition test than is usually done. In what we're going to call the baseline target condition, you get the thing you studied, and there are 2 distractor items in there that kind of look like one another, but they don't look like anything you've studied. They're not related to anything you've studied. They look like one another because they're a necessary control for one of the critical conditions that we'll come to in a minute. So that's just a straight-up recognition condition, and what you as a subject are told to do is pick out the one you remember from the list, if you remember one, and if you can't remember one, you reject all 3 items as new. You say nothing here was on the list. So it's choose one or reject all 3 as new. The baseline FOIL condition, it's a little bit dark there, you can't quite see that. Those are 2 cats and a mug of beer. None of those items are related to anything you presented on the list. So that's baseline FOIL. You should be able to reject those and say, no, I never saw any of those. Again, 2 items look like one another because it's a necessary control for other conditions. In the single related item condition, that's kind of a standard false recognition condition within the context of this paradigm. Now I'm showing you a car that kind of looks like the car that you saw. It's a different color, but it's a car. And so there we expect to see some reasonable GIST-based false recognition effect, even based on just exposure to a single item. And again, the pretzels, you didn't see anything like that, and they look like one another because that's part of the design and necessary to control for effects in the critical condition, which is the target and related item condition. So now we're going to give you the lure item, the car that just looks like what you saw, but we're going to give you the option of choosing the target. If in the single related item condition, the logic goes, you're false alarming because you've lost details from memory, and all you have is you knew you saw a car and you really don't know any details about it, then providing the target item should have little or no effect. On the other hand, if the details are there and you're just not using them, then there should be a big effect of allowing you now to make that distinction between the two cars. And what was found here, I'm just going to show you parts of the data. Again, those who are interested can check out the paper in JML. We found that the standard GIST-based false recognition effect is observed when the target item is not present at test. So you're false alarming, claiming to have seen that blue car, even though you didn't. You're false alarming to that much more often than you're going to false alarm to an unrelated item. So that's a standard GIST-based false recognition effect of the kind that we come to expect. But what happens when you present the target with the related item? Now people predominantly choose the target. They hardly ever go for the related item. They barely go for it more than the totally unrelated item, the cow, and then over on the right, that's the percentage of new responses. So there's a dramatic reduction in false recognition when you have the option to choose the target. We're interested in the question of whether this reduction is due to just paying more attention to the physical or visual properties of the items when there are 2 related items present. So you could say, look, in the target and related item condition, you've got 2 cars there. They're really going to scrutinize those closely. They're just paying more attention to it. And maybe in the standard condition, they just see car and they go, oh, I saw a car. I'll say yes to that. So maybe it's just having another related item there, and it's not really the target itself that matters so much. So the second experiment tried to address this issue by including a 2 related items condition. So now you see 2 cars. So if it's really attention to detail, that should really cause you to carefully scrutinize those two. And if that's the reason why you were unable to inhibit your false alarms in the standard conditions, that should produce a reduction of false alarm, because now you're really looking closely and you say, you know what, neither of those are on there. I'm convinced of it. On the other hand, if it's reinstating the target that's critical, then this shouldn't have much of an effect. And this experiment, interestingly, was done with eye tracking. So Scott was able to track the eye movements that people made, and the eye tracking data confirmed that in this two related items condition, you're going back and forth and comparing the two. You're really scrutinizing them just as you are in the other condition. But the critical finding here is that there's no effect in reducing GIST-based false recognition of providing the two lure items. It's just as much just as big an effect as when you only present one, and only the condition where you present the studied item knocks down false recognition. That was replicated in this experiment. So some conclusions. Robust GIST-based false recognition persists even when subjects are attending to specific object details. That's that two related item condition from experiment 2, confirmed by eye tracking. GIST-based false recognition seems to be almost entirely eliminated when subjects are given the opportunity to choose the correct target. So that would lead us to conclude that details are still stored, but participants are not able to gain access to them unless the target is present, suggesting to us that retrieval failure is a key contributor to GIST-based false recognition. There's some interesting potential implications of these findings and paradigm that we're now starting to explore. For example, what about healthy older adults who in many, not all, but in many paradigms exhibit increased GIST-based false recognition? Can you reduce it by providing them with the opportunity to choose the correct target? Or even more extreme frontal lobe patients who show very high levels of false recognition, can you modulate their response by providing access to the details? Another point to note is that this is a little bit reminiscent of earlier findings concerning misinformation effects, suggestibility and misinformation effects that have been demonstrated in many studies by Loftus and her colleagues. And although they were going about it for different reasons, McCloskey and Zaragoza, in a terrific paper published in 1985, showed you can make those effects go away with the two alternative force choice recognition tests that kind of does some of the same things that the target-based test does here. So it's an interesting point of connection possibly to that literature. Oops, okay. Part number 3 of the talk, we're going to talk about misattribution in relation to the very interesting phenomenon of memory reactivation. Now, we know that if you reactivate a memory for a past experience, that reactivation can have effects on subsequent memory for the experience that you've reactivated. There are various lines of evidence for this. For example, one that's become very prominent recently is the finding that you can increase subsequent memory by reactivating memory on a test. The testing effect, reviewed nicely by Roediger and Karpicki, who have done a lot of work on this topic in their 2006 Perspectives on Psych Science paper, and a lot of relevant work since. It's a good way to study reactivating a memory through during testing. But there's also reason to believe that when you reactivate a memory, you can put it into what's been referred to as a labile state, where the memory is prone to disruption and possible distortion. This is the phenomenon known primarily in the behavioral neuroscience literature as the phenomenon of reconsolidation. When a memory is reactivated, you have to consolidate it, put it back into memory all over again. And if you interfere with those consolidation processes, you can actually impair the ability to retrieve what would seem to have been a totally consolidated memory. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. And Karim Nader, Joe Ledoux, and others have studied it very nicely. And there's a nice paper in the Annual Review of Psychology from Karim Nader's lab, led by Hart, that reviews this literature and talks about it in relation to memory distortion. And this may reflect, Scott Guerin, Peggy St. Jacques, and I suggested in a review article on memory distortion published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences last year, the operation of memory updating processes. Memory updating is very important. You want to update your memory, but sometime updating your memory may include information that results in distortion. Very little is known about how varying the properties of the reactivation process itself may affect, if it does at all, true or false memories. So Peggy St. Jacques, who's currently a postdoc in the lab, came up with a very interesting paradigm to investigate this issue using kind of more of a real-world memory paradigm than I've talked about so far. So in this paradigm, the participants went on guided tours of exhibits in two museums that are near the psychology department at Harvard, the adjoining Harvard Museum of Natural History and the Peabody Museum. They go on a guided tour of these museums. And that tour guides them to view some items in each of several exhibits distributed out throughout the two museums. There are a total of 32 items, several ones from each exhibit, and not others. So they're looking at some of the things in an exhibit, and those are going to be our remembered items, but they're not looking at other things in the exhibit. And during the tour, the participants wore what's known nowadays as a Vicon review camera, also been referred to as a sense cam. And this is a camera that you just wear around your neck, just like this badge, and it takes photos of what's in front of you every 15 seconds. This is what the Vicon review camera looks like. So our participants went out into the museums with these cameras taking photos of things that happen every 15 seconds. That way we can know exactly what they encountered in the exhibit, and we can be sure that they didn't look at any of the stuff that we didn't want them to look at. So this is kind of what the images look like from the Vicon review camera. Participant going through this exhibit of flowers, seeing the entry to the famous glass flower exhibit. There's a kind of fisheye view of one of the rooms that they're in. So these are the kind of pictures that the Vicon review takes. 48 hours after they go on their tour, the participants come to the memory lab for a reactivation session. And there what happens is that they view, I'm going to show this to you in a second, what we call an event movie, consisting of photos of exhibit items they had seen in the tour, and they made a judgment about the relatedness of an item that was in the exhibit but they hadn't seen to the items that they had seen. Could this item, this item, have fit in that exhibit? And we manipulated the properties of reactivation by manipulations that I'll show you in just one second. That's really the key to the experiment. And then 48 hours after this reactivation session, the participants are given a recognition test that includes items from the tour that they saw, items from the reactivation session, and novel baseline items. So here's a schematic of the design. And the critical manipulation here is between what we call a reactivation match and mismatch. In the reactivation match condition, that's the event movie. Again, the slides are a little bit darker than they're looking on my computer, but I hope you can see them. So there's 4 consecutive images of what this participant saw in a particular exhibit. They come up about 5 to 7 seconds each, and then there's a brief wait, and then the item that could have been in the exhibit but is not comes up, and they make a relatedness judgment, 1 low to 5 high. So a 1 would be, no, that really couldn't have been in the exhibit that these other things were in. 5 would be, yeah, that's highly related. It could have been in. The reliving thing comes up in experiment 2. I'll get back to that in a minute. So that's the reactivation match condition. In the reactivation mismatch conditions, there were 2 in different experiments. In experiment 1, there's a mismatch is manipulated by a temporal manipulation. So the last 2 slides, you'll note, are in different orders in the 2 in the 2 event movies. It's the correct order in the match condition, and it's the wrong order in the mismatch condition. There's evidence in the autobiographical memory literature indicating that reinstating temporal context, the correct temporal order, can increase your memory. So the thought is there'll be a stronger reactivation, if you will, in the match condition than in the mismatch condition. and they're making the same judgment about the relatedness of the novel items. The second experiment compares the reactivation match condition to a different kind of mismatch condition, a perspective manipulation. So now what you're seeing are pictures of the items that you saw, but it's from a really different perspective, kind of a distorted perspective. So it's thought that these will reactivate your memory of that museum tour somewhat, but not as well as it is in the match condition. And then you're making a judgment on the related item, also from a kind of distorted perspective. And now there's another measure added in, a reliving measure, where for the items that you've seen, you're judging how strongly am I reliving that experience of seeing this item in the museum. 1, not much. 5, I'm really reliving it. That turns out to be important for the results. Okay. Here are the data. This will be coming out pretty soon, I think, in Psychological Science. Just a recap of the experimental design on the top. And the data I'm showing you are corrected for baseline. So we take out the hit rate to non-reactivated items. How often do people say they remember something from the museum that wasn't reactivated? And similarly, the false alarm rate for non-reactivated items is subtracted out. And what you see here, if we focus first on the B side, that's experiment 1, if we compare the match to the mismatch conditions, for both hits and false alarms, there's an overall effect of reactivation, whereby reactivating the item increases the hit rate somewhat, really increases the false alarm rate, and then the critical finding is that there's an effect of reactivation match versus mismatch on both hits and false alarms. So when you strongly reactivate the item, according to our logic, you're getting a benefit of a higher hit rate, but you're paying for that with a higher false alarm rate, as that seems to get more incorporated into your representation of what happened in the museum. In the slide on the right, this effect occurs, but it's modulated by reliving ratings. So we're only seeing that effect of more hits and more false alarms over on the right side. That's for high reliving ratings. When you really have the feeling that you're reliving the item during reactivation, that produces a higher hit rate later on in the match condition than the mismatch condition, but it also produces a higher false alarm rate later on in the match condition than the mismatch condition. So we think this is very interesting evidence that the properties of reactivation can really have an effect on memory. Perhaps it's an updating mechanism that results both in an increase in hits and false alarms. And Peggy has followed up on this with an fMRI version of the experiment that looks quite interesting, and she's just analyzing those data now. Okay, to wrap up then, I want to just say a couple of words about misattribution as it relates to adaptive memory processes. So one of the issues I discussed back in the original Seven Sins article and book is the question of, are the 7 sins really sins? Are they really defects in memory, or flaws in memory, real problems in memory? And the answer was no, that another way to think of them is that they're kind of costs we pay for benefits in memory that make the system work generally as well as it does. There's an upside and a downside to most memory processes. An example of this would be, for example, with persistence, unwanted recollections that people can't forget. The way I talked about that was in terms of a lot of work that's shown that when we're faced with emotionally arousing events, highly threatening events that could threaten our survival, we tend to have a really good memory for those highly arousing emotional events, and that's a good thing. But maybe we can think of persistence, kind of unwanted intrusion of these kinds of highly arousing events as the downside of that good thing in memory, and try to make that argument for each of the 7 sins. Well, going back to misattribution, the way I talked about it in the 1991 and 2001 publications is basically in terms of the idea that many misattributions occur because we typically don't need to remember every detail of every experience. We wouldn't want to. And perhaps we're just better off sometimes remembering the gist, which, as we've, can promote retention of meaning and general themes, does a lot of good things, but sets the stage for misattribution errors. Now, I still think there's definitely something to say for that view, although in light of the Garin data that we talked about, showing the importance of retrieval factors, we might have to reconceptualize this more in terms of the retrieval side than the storage side. But there have been some interesting recent developments on this front. First of all, there's much more evidence than when I wrote the paper or the book for an adaptive view of misattribution or memory distortion. Just to take one of several examples, an interesting paper by Dewhurst and colleagues showing that susceptibility to DRM false recognition is measured by performance on basically a creativity test that measures convergent thinking. People who are more able to come up with broad and numerous associations also tend to be a bit more prone to this false memory effect, suggesting that the processes that drive the false memory effect are also doing some good things for cognitive function. And there's other evidence discussed in the TICS article I mentioned. Mark Howe has a nice review on this topic in Current Directions in Psychological Science. But then to just quickly finish up, probably the biggest development in our lab has been to link this misattribution and adaptive function idea to the idea that memory plays an important role in imagining the future, that we use our episodic memories, which we focus on today, to imagine possible future scenarios. And this kind of constructive activity requires the ability to flexibly access elements of past experience. And this very flexibility of memory may sometimes produce misattributions and related memory distortions. In my talk yesterday, I went through a lot of evidence showing that this future simulation process, while not perfect, is an adaptive process that can enhance cognitive function in a number of ways. And there's a lot of work now showing that there are similar brain regions involved in remembering past events and imagining future events that have led us to the view that it's also important to think of memory as a tool used by the brain to generate simulations of possible future events. This may have some costs, but we also think it's a useful way to start thinking about the 7 sins of memory. And in closing, I just want to acknowledge many members of my lab, collaborators, and support from NIMH and NIA, and thanks for your attention.